Okay, thank you very much for coming. I was going to introduce Ian, but you can read his bio in the meeting back. And instead, I will leave all the time for him. We have 1 hour with questions, and this is so. Please don't ask questions or comments until he finishes. There will be time for that later.
Okay, thanks very much. I am extremely grateful for the opportunity to come and talk to you here. I'm pretty sure this is probably my favourite campus in the world, and there's some absolutely wonderful people here. I particularly want to thank Dave and Mike, who've sort of encouraged me for years and always been extremely friendly. Dan, because he's a great guy, and we hate that. And in particular, Harman for arranging this. Thank you very much. I'm very touched by that. Right, so you can see the title there. You'll probably be surprised at the author list. It's because what I'm going to talk about is highly interdisciplinary. So there's only a minority of people here who are economists, actually. People from all over the place, lots of different disciplines. And the reason for that is because if you want to look at food security, climate change and biodiversity loss, then you have to immediately recognise that these are connected challenges. And trying to solve them separately is at absolute best highly inefficient, and actually can many times be retrograde, can actually make things worse. There's also, because of the nature of this, there's no single discipline that can solve these challenges. Okay, we have to have multiple perspectives to actually tackle these real world connections. So I think of environmental economics. I think environmental economics won't save the world, but there is no saving the world without environmental economics. So I'm going to focus on two very basic but frequently overlooked challenges, research challenges. And the first is really obvious, that if we don't consider all the costs and all the benefits of a proposed change, then we just don't know what the actual consequence of that change is. And unfortunately, that challenge is very rarely met. What we actually see, and if you look at the literatures in almost any discipline, is you see what I would call focused analyses. They look at one element of a problem and often come to conclusions just based on that element. You should do this. Well, not necessarily at all, because you've got to consider those wider effects. And the second is that if we don't present research in a way that decision makers can use, then they won't use it. And I think this is a challenge to us. I don't think it's the problem of the decision makers. We love to say, oh, well, we did the research and they just ignored it. No. You did the research and you didn't translate it into a language or an approach that was compatible with real world decision making. So the other part of the talk I'm going to be looking at is the idea of co-designing decision support systems, co-design with the people that are actually going to use them. Okay, so looking at that first issue, focusing problems, and it actually comes from Daniel Kahneman's focusing illusion. Here's a very typical analysis. There's one going on in the UK right now, and it's looking at the use of trees to store carbon. And it certainly claims to be an incredibly thorough analysis. It's looking at different species, it's looking at different locations, it's looking at effects over time. It's even looking at the end use of that carbon when you cut the trees down. That is not the full issue. The full issue is to look at the system that this is part of, because when you do this, you are going to affect all of these things as well. So, for example, you're going to affect agriculture. These trees are going to go somewhere. They're going to displace generally agriculture. That's going to affect food supplies. It might affect trade. It's going to affect also water systems, biodiversity, all these different things. And to make a decision based on this is risking a wider system effect, which you just don't know about. And so we need to bring that in. And that's why we're going to need these decision support systems, because as you can see, it's complex. The real world is complex. And yes, complex is difficult, but I would venture to say ignoring that complexity is why we're in the situation we're in now. Why did we make certain energy choices or transport choices, that sort of stuff? Because we just didn't think about the wider effects of it. So focusing, I think, is one of the biggest problems that we have. We have to therefore turn that into a set of analyses. Now we're lucky because that individual disciplinary research has provided us with a plethora of models that are out there. Most of the models that I've got up here, they already predate the research I'm going to talk about, but they weren't linked together. And we're going to use a variety of techniques to link them together. And if you don't, then you don't know the consequence of the changes that you're contemplating. There is, however, a practical problem. And that is that many of these models, they're often called process models. So they're mathematical models. They're not particularly statistical. They literally say, right, a tree grows by A times height and elevation, and B times the amount of sunshine, and C times the amount of water, that sort of thing. These process models, they're very detailed and they are very slow to run. And here's an example. So this is, by common consent, at least in Europe, one of the best models of plant and tree growth that exists, JULES. And it's phenomenally complex. And one of the problems is you can't use this unless you're a real JULES expert. So nobody who doesn't have at least a PhD in using these sort of models can use them. And that rolls out almost every decision maker I've ever met. They're also phenomenally slow. So you can take a few days programming one run in JULES. It will then run for a couple of days and you get an answer and you find out it's rubbish. So you have to start again. Now, what we want to do as economists, glad you could make it. Cheers. I came in from the UK, but
first 5 minutes.
Right. Very, very slow. Okay. What we want to do is, we're economists, we want to optimize. Okay, which means we're going to have to run models thousands of times before we happen to chance on that optimal combination. Right. So we have to change how these operate. And we've been very fortunate. We've hired some really fantastic mathematicians who have brought the power of artificial intelligence to doing this. But the principles of it are actually quite simple. So what you do is you say, right, well, these models, they run by taking a site, taking all the conditions of that site, working it through and working out what happens to the tree growth on that site. In other words, there's inputs to this model and there's outputs. Now, what we can now do is think about using these models in a different way. We can hire some extra people, use some very, very fast computers, and we can build up what's called an emulation training set. So we run this a few times. In fact, actually, we ran it nearly 200 times, which took nearly 200 days, by the way, even with a bank of people and some very fast computers. But every time we ran it, we stored the inputs and we stored the outputs. And that allows you to do something called emulation, which is basically skipping straight from inputs to outputs without using this bit in the middle. You generate a new model. Okay? This model runs really fast. This model runs in seconds rather than days or nearly a year. And it allows you to fill in the gaps, if you like. You can apply that emulated model at high resolution across the whole decision space at any resolution that you want. Okay. But the most important question that you need to answer straight away is, well, does that really work? How valid is that emulated model? So what we've got here, here's all the sites that we emulated, that we ran. Okay, and we're going to now emulate it for absolutely everywhere. And we're going to compare in an out of sample, actual versus predicted test, our emulation of the results with what the original JAWS model said it was. And what you can see, I've got to blow this right up before you can even detect any difference at all. It fits extremely well. Okay, so now we've got a model which is valid and really fast, and we can use that approach to every one of those models in the network. You can now begin also to produce some quite nice tools for decision makers. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but let's try it. Oh yeah, okay. So because it never works online, I'll just take the video, but this is real time. So you can see here, I wonder what will happen if I click that up and down. Okay, that's a shame. All right, I'll do it on here. Sorry about that. So if I click that, happens. Sorry. Okay, I'm just going to have to, I'll just have to talk really fast while it does it. Oh, bugger. No, it's not doing it at all. Come on. Yeah. Sorry, it did work earlier. It's not working now, of course. Come on. Oh, crap. Okay, right. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try this. Okay, will that work? No.
Click on the little triangle at the bottom of the corner.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah,
right, you see what's happening. Choosing an analytical period, adding trees, just at quite coarse resolution. This is 1 every 5 kilometres, start off with. And you can see as I click through, I can see the amount of carbon that's being stored over time as I move from different locations. I can now change the climate into the future. Okay, so that's RCP6. Okay, and it changes the amount of both carbon and the confidence around it. You can change it to any RCP you like. So these are the IPC ones. This is a big result. Bang! Change where you're planting it, and it makes a massive difference to the amount of carbon that you store. You can do an analysis that would take 21 years using JAWS that fast. Because you're using these emulated models. Really, really, suddenly these models, which have never been used in decision making, now become actually useful. Okay, sorry that was so fast. Which one is it? Is it that? Not sure. No, I think it's actually that.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to bring all those models together. We're going to network them together. We're going to bring together models of the factors that alter land use. Because, and this was a surprise to some of my science colleagues, things happen in places which are not necessarily the very best place scientifically for them to occur. Why? Because they're the best economic place for them to occur. So these are economic models driving land use change using a whole variety of variables. They will generate a whole raft of values, and that will tell us about the market values that we get from land use change. But of course, as environmental economists, we're also interested in the non-market values of all these externalities as well. And it's only by bringing these two things together that we get the social value of this change. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of each of these models. So start off with the agricultural ones. Very lucky in the UK. It's probably the same here. Just amazing data, really good time series, really good spatial resolution. And you can bring all these different factors together and get models that work really well. And here's the validation for this model. So this is an out sample test again. These predictions of land use, and that's what actually happened. So they fit very well. And because they fit well, you can now see, well, what will the model tell us about the reactions to change going into the future? For example, climate change. So we know more about climate change over time than almost any other variable. We don't know what the price of wheat's going to be in 20 years' time, but we've got a really good idea of what the temperature will be in growing seasons and rainfall as well. This is UK, well, technically Great Britain. It's a wet, soggy country. I would really advise you to stay here. However, by the time you get to 2060, you might want to consider visiting it because it's going to get a lot warmer and actually a lot drier, and that's going to be nice for you. But it's also going to be nice for a lot of things that grow because at the moment the UK is too cold, it's too wet. And so you're going to see that reflected in changes in land use over time. So here's two major land uses. You've got arable and livestock. This is distribution at the moment. And as we roll forward into time, we can see that as temperatures increase, and rainfall gets more under control, you can see an increase in the arable area, and the livestocking gets pushed up into the mountainous areas of the country. That's also going to be the case for a lot of other growth. So here we've got trees. Here's the main commercial crop in the UK, Sitka spruce. Now, look at them carefully. At first glance, you think, well, maybe there's not so much change. Actually, this is phenomenal change for such a short period of time. This is a faster change, much faster than anything that's happened since the Ice Age. And you've got this very important commercial crop virtually getting pushed into the sea as the land gets drier and hotter. But there's other species, such as oak, which will move in from continental Europe and actually perform pretty well. Still very slow growing compared to that, so the carbon consequences are important. Modelling those carbon consequences, there's loads of models that you need to bring together for this, and you can see them all in there. And once you've done that, you can begin to patch together what is going to happen to carbon over time under different land uses. You can also take into account the impacts of different management regimes. So, for example, suppose we plant with an idea of not producing low quality wood that's just going to go into cardboard boxes. That's carbon's going to be released very fast. Instead, we plant wood that's going to go into homes and be locked up for carbon locked up for a long time. What about looking at the economics of that? So we actually don't value carbon. I don't think any country in the world actually values carbon, because to do that, you need to know what the benefits of avoided climate change are, and that's really complex. So instead, we work out the cost of removing or avoiding an emission of a ton of carbon. And there are many ways you can do that. Lots of technologies, they all have different costs. So here we've got a constant benefit in terms of a ton of carbon being stored, but you can see the costs are massively different. Some of the costs are negative, which means they're actual benefits you know, why the government doesn't, for example, invest in insulation is beyond me, because the benefits outweigh the costs absolutely enormously. And you can see what these people have done here. They've stacked those different technologies from the cheapest to the most expensive. Obviously, you want to start over here, okay? And you want to be paying for insulation and stuff like that, okay? Amazingly, for whatever reasons, Britain just announced a massive investment in this technology here, which makes absolutely no economic sense at all, apart from you could be cynical and say it allows the oil companies to keep pumping and us all to keep driving emitting cars. So, all right, going back to that, another important set of linkages is models on water quality. So we've got models on the different nutrients we've got, also sediments, and pesticides, stuff like that, and linking them to their impact on water quality, from which you can then think about, right, what's the effect that's going to be on market values of water quality, and what about the non-market values that you get out of water, okay? How are we going to actually value that? Now, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with this. I'll just go through quickly. You can look at reveal preference methods, looking at people's behaviour. For example, the travel cost method is where you've got data on where people live, where they visit and how often, and even on the routes they are likely to have taken. You can link that to data on the quality of those sites. And suddenly, things like the abnormally high number of visits a long way away make a lot of sense, because it's a fantastic site over here. Now you've basically got all the information you need to value recreation. You know the costs associated with these trips, you know the number of trips, you know the quality of the sites that they're visiting. So you can put it into a reveal preference model, like the random utility model, and just relate those trips to those costs and qualities. A little bit of rearrangement of that function will allow you to relate quality to money. And so you can see what's the value of going from a poor site to a high quality site. By the way, this was the focus of one of our earliest tools. So all the tools we produce are open access, they're free to use, they're online. We are in a strange situation that we can get money to develop these tools. We have no money ever to maintain them. And that's a weird facet of the Research Council system in the UK. They'll pay you millions to develop something and won't pay you a penny to keep it running. We have managed to keep it running just by, this is recorded, so by prudential decision making. That's all I'm going to say on that. Right, and you get results out of this which are very interesting and I think somewhat revealing. So here's the areas of highest recreational value. Okay, they are where the big cities are. They are not where the national parks are. Okay, we think of the national parks as the jewels, and you know, they are objectively, but what recreational resources generate the biggest amount of recreational value? It's the local parks, near to where people live. And this is particularly important when you're thinking about access to a better quality of life, particularly for disadvantaged communities. There is no point putting a park 10 minutes drive away from some of the poorest communities in Britain because they haven't got a car. So you need to put them really close. Biodiversity is perhaps the one that I find most intriguing and interesting. You can model the relationship between changes in drivers, changes in land use, and changes in biodiversity, all in quantity terms. You can do that. You can produce pretty good models for lots and lots of species. You can come up with results that are quite disturbing. So this is the effect on native woodland birds of just expected climate change over the next sort of 50 years or so, and losses in much of lowland Britain. But it's very difficult to value biodiversity. Now, there's been some great attempts to do it, to ask people willingness to pay for biodiversity and that sort of stuff. I don't have complete confidence in those numbers. So instead, what we've done is we've taken a cost approach, just the same as carbon. So we've said, well, we might not know what the willingness to pay for biodiversity is, but we do know how much it costs to provide that biodiversity. And what is fascinating about that, I feel, is that the costs vary spatially. So they vary according to which technology, which approach you use, obviously, but they also, even within a given technology, they will vary across space. They'll vary because, for example, you're taking out agricultural land of differing opportunity cost. They're going to vary because the land you're taking out is maybe adjoined to different habitat areas, so it'll have different effectiveness. And what you can see here is that some technologies are relatively low cost, some are high cost, but even within the low cost, there are big variations because of space. And this is something that I think is wonderful about environmental economics. It brings in so much of interest that normal economics never encounters. It just says, what's the cost of steel? Well, that's not really a logical question for the environment. It's more, what's the costs of, in this case, biodiversity? It depends where you do it. And there's a little film that my colleague Amy Binner made of just highlighting where would you start first, and then if you want to save more and more biodiversity, where do you spread to? So what you've got here is different costs, different cost effectiveness of saving the same amount of biodiversity, and that allows us to estimate again the exact simile of the carbon marginal abatement curve. Now we call it marginal cost of nature restoration, and it's the same idea before. So here we've just got one technology, and we've ranked it from the cheapest places to do it to the more expensive. We've now got an analysis, which unfortunately I haven't got the graphs on, where we use multiple technologies, and you can create a cost envelope across them. So obviously you start off with the cheapest places, the cheapest, most effective places. Sorry, you start off with the most cost-effective places. That's not necessarily the cheapest place. It's the place where per pound you get the most biodiversity. And, what you now do is decide, well, how much biodiversity do I want? And because I'm not completely convinced by the willingness to pay literature on it, I'm going with what the ecologists say. They say, right, well, I've just made this number up, but suppose they said, well, we need that for a sustainable biodiversity in the country. Okay, that's what we need, and you can now work out the costs, the minimum costs of attaining that. There's still, I think, some really interesting questions left in this particular research, but nevertheless, I think it's an interesting way of looking at these things. Okay, we've spent a lot of time looking at that first question. How do we get away from focused analyses and towards a more comprehensive approach of all the benefits and costs? I want to finish off by looking at how do we take that and make sure it's embedded within actual decision-making systems. And I'm very pleased to say that about October last year, we basically signed a new contract with DEFRA to finish developing this and for them to use it to direct their farm subsidies through it. and that's £3 billion a year being put through these systems. We've got this grant called Net Zero Plus, and that's the logo of it. And if you notice a similarity between that and the Rebellion Alliance in Star Wars, it's completely deliberate. Lots of ego problems in our team, and these are the people that we're working with. So a real good mix of government, farmers, conservation groups, a real mix. And actually companies that aren't really involved in the environment, but because the laws are changing, they realise they have to get involved in it because there's now biodiversity laws, there's carbon laws, that sort of stuff. Okay, so we're working with these groups to design apps for them to bring decisions into their institutions. The apps work for the whole of GB, which is this bit here. We haven't actually sorted out Northern Ireland yet because of data issues, but long term we hope so. I'm going to just look at one tiny area down here just to illustrate it. So how do we help decision makers design policy? The first thing we do, so we've selected that, well, they've selected that area. They can select anywhere of any shape in GB, and they decide what their targets are. So here we've got a whole range of things that they might have targets about. The actual list is much longer than this, but here we've got the amount of carbon they want to store, and they've said, oh, well, this is the amount we want to store. Okay, some biodiversity ones, the budget that they want to use, the area that they want to change, in this case plants, and the amount of recreation that they generate. Okay, and we feed that into the decision support system, and well, it actually gives us one of two possible results. The first is you can't do it. For example, you haven't got enough budget for all these sort of things, so it just says, sorry, can't do. You're going to have to change something. You're either going to have to plant less area, increase your budget, change your targets. But eventually it starts spitting out options. And here's an option now. Here's a planting strategy that will give you all of the targets that you want. Okay, there's they can view it obviously spatially, but they can also view it over time, and it tells them about the sort of things that they're interested in, like the amount of CO2 that's being stored across time, maybe the amount of food production that is being lost. Now, one of the not problems, one of the features of doing this is, I've said, they put their targets in, and initially it says, well, none of that is possible. Right, so they change things, and suddenly it goes from none of them being possible to typically many ways of delivering the targets that you want. In fact, it can suddenly go to hundreds and thousands of ways of doing that, all of which satisfy their requirements. And they might just say, that's great, yeah, we'll take number one, that's great. But they might, an interesting question that you can then ask them is say, right, everything we're going to show you satisfies your targets. Here's two, okay? Both of these satisfy the targets that you want. How about you telling us which one you prefer? And for those of you that are familiar with choice experiments, you can see what's actually happening here. You've got a space, and it might be 100,000 options that will satisfy those targets. You get them to choose between two. There's an AI system below it that cleverly picks out options which will close down that number of overall options really, really fast, so that you can go from 100,000 options to actually the one you want in just a very few, less than a dozen questions. It can close it down because it just says, all right, well, you chose this rather than this. So there's a whole sector of those 100,000 that I know is inferior to this. So I can just throw them away. I never need to ask you about them again. So very quickly you get down to a very small number of options. I want to finish this by comparing this approach with other approaches. 3 approaches to land use decision making. The first, what happens in the UK at the moment? The government announces a subsidy. It says we will pay X per hectare for you to plant trees or to create wildlife habitat or whatever they want to do. All right, flat rate. The second is one that I haven't mentioned yet, but I want to raise it because it's becoming more common, and that is to bring in some experts and some stakeholders, maybe some farmers, maybe some conservation groups, maybe a hydrologist or something like that. Bring them into a room and ask them to design a future for the country. And third, the one that I've been talking about, this decision support system. I'm going to compare these 3 against the same challenge for each. Plant 2 million hectares of new forest in the UK. This is along the lines of what the government is planning to do between now and 2050. 2050, the UK's got to hit net zero. So it's one of the things it's doing is planting a lot of trees. This is the outcome when you use the current approach of flat rate subsidies. You can use that uptake model that I showed, the agricultural model, to say who is expected to take up a subsidy at a certain level sufficient that we get 2 million hectares of woodland being planted. And these are the locations. Now, if you're not familiar with the UK, these are some of the worst agricultural lands in Britain. And that's exactly what you'd expect, because these are the people who've got the lowest opportunity cost. Okay, so they're going to be much more interested in taking up these grants. The loss of agricultural value, you can see there, that's the main market value. It generates a fair bit of non-market value, principally in terms of recreation. Sorry, is the big one that it generates there. So overall, it looks like it's a good idea, and this is really dangerous because it says, oh yeah, benefits are bigger than costs, so surely you should go ahead. Well, what is disastrous about this is because a lot of those bad farming areas are very high in carbon, some of them are almost peatlands. You plant the trees on them, it dries the land out, and the soil starts emitting carbon. So the net effect is actually, after 50 years, it's not that you've stored, you've actually emitted carbon overall. There is a negative effect on biodiversity. Most of that is unavoidable because of what's happening to climate change. See how the stakeholder one did. Immediately you can see a radically different future for Britain. Both of these have 2 million hectares of forestry in them. It doesn't look like it, but they do. It's just that here it's very concentrated. Here it's smeared at low density across almost the entire country. Why? Because the experts felt that was the best approach. It's fair, you know, everybody should have some trees near them. Well, actually, that's not quite true because there's large areas here that there's virtually nobody living in it anyway. Much bigger impact on agriculture. You know, roughly doubles the impact on agriculture, actually generates slightly less in the way of non-market values, and the net is pretty bad. But one thing in its favour, it stores a lot of carbon. Why? Well, mainly because it's taken off some really good agricultural land and shoved trees onto them. Okay, so is that a good idea? Well, you know, if we're economists, it doesn't look so good. You know, it's reducing the value. But let's look at the final one, the decision support system. What it's done is it's taken into account not just the agricultural opportunity cost, but also the amount of carbon that's being fixed. It also looks at biodiversity, it looks at water quality, it looks at a lot of other things, and it plants in subtly different areas compared to this. So if you look at the two, you can see there is quite a difference between the two. The consequence is dramatic. So almost a doubling in the net benefits that you get from this. And because it's constrained optimization, it hits exactly, got to mention this, the net zero target for woodland. Okay. It's also got some nice features. It's actually, okay, biodiversity is still going to have a bad time in Britain, but it's slightly improved by this model. So when you compare this to either of these, I mean, this is awful because of its net benefits. This is awful because of its impact on carbon. This is clearly superior on multiple grounds. Why are these results so different? Well, flat rate ignores reality. It ignores the fact that if you're paying the same amount, irrespective of the area, that's like saying we'll pay you the same irrespective of what you give us in return. We would never do this in any other area of life. If you went to the supermarket and said, here's $100, just give me whatever you want, you know, and somebody gave you a lot and somebody gave you virtually nothing, you wouldn't be very happy. But in Britain, as a taxpayer, that is exactly what you're doing. You're paying the same amount irrespective of the outcome. Second is, well, we've already seen this, we're ignoring all these externalities from the decision. Can we fix this? Yes, we can. The decision support system will tell us what the costs are of planting in different places. It will tell us about what the costs and benefits are in terms of the outcomes from those change, so we can optimize land use. But that's optimization theoretically. Can we actually deliver it? Again, yes, we can, because we can actually change the way that we allocate subsidies. Instead of saying flat rates, everybody gets the same, we actually use environmental markets. And these are already being used in the UK, and they are basically matching suppliers, farmers, with demanders, which might be companies, might be the government, whatever, and producing very much better results in terms of the net benefits that are coming out of this. I wanted to finish with just two last things, which are very recent stuff that we've been doing. First of all, bringing in uncertainty. Whoops. I think there's been an amazing series of developments under the IPCC. I'm a very strong supporter of the IPCC, but they basically say the world could be like this or the world could be like that. It could be that we actually obey Paris and the Paris Accord and actually do something about climate change, or we don't, and climate change gets out of hand. The consequences of this are absolutely dire for almost every single policy you can think of. It brings in huge uncertainty. So, for example, in planting trees, the thing we're talking about, if the world is like this, and we actually do stick to Paris, you ought to be planting very fast-growing conifers because they won't die in the future heat and they'll store a lot of carbon. If, however, things get out of control, there's no point planting the conifers, they'll all be dead. So you're better off planting species that can actually cope with those higher temperatures. What you can see is that the best choice under one future can be the worst choice under another. And in fact, as climate change increases, which of these futures, here's another one, so there's a sort of, that's all conifer, that's all broadleaf, here's something in the middle. Which one of these works better switches all the way through as climate change increases? And this brings us to a couple of quite interesting little points. I've already mentioned that one. One is to note that the more that climate change gets away from us, the more that the value of a ton of carbon goes up, which is perverse, really. But it's an obvious consequence. And secondly, we can take a portfolio of risks across this. Instead of gambling on a good future or a bad future, we can actually spread our investments. So here we've got the payoffs under those three climate futures, and you can see there's a big spread and it changes as climates get warmer. Okay. What happens if you take an expected value approach? If you say I'm risk neutral, okay, a pound loss is the same utility change but negative as a pound gain. Okay, well, you have this sort of approach here, and you plant accordingly. I've just randomly picked out one value, a loss of 10 billion. Okay, there's a 9% chance of that. Suppose that you are risk averse. Instead, you want to only take a 5% chance of this negative outcome. You will alter your planting strategy. So what you do doesn't just depend on the realities of the science and the economics. It also depends on how you feel about that, the risks you're prepared to take or not. Okay, this is all calculated in terms of money. We might want to be risk averse in terms of money losses. If instead we wanted to be risk averse in terms of, say, carbon emissions, you would get yet a further outcome in terms of the maps that would come out. Last slide, you'll be glad to hear. I wanted to finish on something that we're doing right now. So these results are just preliminary, but I think they're quite startling. What we've been doing is we've been working with Purdue University, who are the makers of something called GTAP, which is an agricultural trade. Well, no, it's just trade. It's not agriculture now. It's everything. A trade model encompassing commodity flows around the world. And what we've done is we've taken that and we've said, right, let's hook our land use models into GTAP and see what the consequences are when we plant trees. I'll let you off. When we plant trees, that's going to change the amount of food being produced. If we change the amount of food being produced, Britain's a fairly rich country. It's not going to change the amount of food we eat. It's going to change the amount of imports that come in. And those imports will typically come from countries that are fairly low cost, often low cost because they're using their environments in unsustainable ways, including slash and burn agriculture, other high emission approaches, which means planting trees in Britain in the wrong place will actually result in trees being felled elsewhere around the world. We wanted to see what the sort of consequences were. They look absolutely dramatic. So here we're planting nearly 1 million hectares of trees in the UK, storing a large amount of carbon, and that's the loss of trees elsewhere in the world. So 66% of the carbon that we thought we had stored, we've just emitted it somewhere else in the world. And this applies, as we increase it, it looks fairly constant. You can also look at other ways of storing carbon, and they have consequences as well. Oh, yeah, sorry, summary. We've got to get away from focused analyses. We've got to bring reality into the world, into our analyses, and we've got to work with decision makers to actually help them make decisions. If you want to know more about that, there's papers, and I'd be delighted if anybody can ask any questions. Thank you. Yes.
No, I just want to say that we have more than 30 people online, so maybe if people online want to ask questions, you can do it through the chat, or otherwise I might be able to unmute here. And then for those of you who want to keep talking with Ian, we might go for some soft drinks and some popcorn or something like that upstairs in the room that we always go.
Okay. Do you want to ask it? Because I'm just aware that people online are going to disappear at 12. So any questions to start off with?
Yes, very interesting about all this concept and how you're using it. I go back to where you started. You talk about the AI emulations, models. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I'm trying to understand exactly what the optimization models are doing. Is this AI machine learning so that you're having the inputs, then you're predicting the outputs, and then once you have already developed a training model that is now running okay, now you can just use your inputs just to predict your outputs without necessarily going through the whole process. And that is what is cutting down the time of running this, or what is going on.
Yeah, actually, that's a pretty good description of exactly what's happening, actually. So the AI thing, the people when I did the talk in Brisbane, they said, are you doing anything to do with AI? And I said, well, a little bit. I said, oh, please mention AI, because it's a theme of the conference, so I shoved that in. The AI element there is very, very simple. What it's helping us do is, when you're building that thing that I refer to as a training set, so we've got a process model that's incredibly slow. We can't run it many times. Well, we've actually run it about 200, which the scientists think is fantastic, because they run it like 6 times and choose the best one. That is true. That's how they help government. Anyway, the chances of the best one being in that 6 are virtually nil. Anyway, so we run it once. And the AI element is looking at the variation of the input variables, the soils, the rainfall, the temperatures, all those sort of things. And it says, right, I've got 1 point. I've got a huge amount of unexplained variation. I need to choose a second point. I will choose the second point such that it minimises the amount of remaining variation. And it does that again and again. So after every run of joules, it takes that information and says, right, okay, I now know that bit of the curve pretty well, but there's a bit over here that's all over the place.
So they targeted 200 one. Therefore, the AI model told you what the next one is.
Exactly. It targets the 200, yeah. Okay. Which is not really AI, as in, some of the really fancy ways. But anyway, the lady at Brisbane asked me to put AI up there, and technically it sort of is. But thank you for exposing that fraudulent. I feel more honest now. Any other questions? I think Dan Picture.
So you said no difficult questions. So what's your favourite colour? And then their follow-up question is...
Your paper is accepted.
So you're projecting land use, etc., to 2060 or something like that. So, and talking about climate projections, and we have an idea. But I was wondering about input costs and output prices. So projecting, that's very hard to project every couple of years. So what's happened with beef for the last couple of years. So what are you doing for the input prices and output?
So we very good question, and it is probably the area that I think all agricultural economic analyses of the future are most dodgy. And that's why I said that bit about climate change. We understand climate change so much better. People say, oh yeah, there's uncertainty. There's nowhere near the amount of uncertainty that we have about prices and stuff like that. We used FAO estimates. We also allow for some variability around it. It's the best we can do, really, because we don't. I mean, I'm sure there's people in here that understand future agricultural commodity prices a lot better than we do. But my feeling is, I'm not even convinced we know what direction they're going in, because everybody says, oh, the population's getting bigger. So surely that's going to push up prices. Climate change can surely only be negative. Well, actually, that's not true. There's large areas of the world that at the moment are not suitable for agriculture that will become more suitable in the future. That thing about the UK productivity is going to go up significantly because of climate change. This doesn't mean I think that climate change is a good thing. Climate change is disastrous, and I think it's a huge threat. But when people say, well, what's going to happen to prices? I don't know, really. So I'm just going to go with the FAO. I would also point out that if we go back, well, certainly if you go back about 50 years in agriculture, it's a completely different world to the one we have now. I've been fortunate to be involved for the last few years with some projects on terrestrial aquaculture. So basically growing fish and crustaceans and stuff like that on farms in tanks. They are phenomenally productive. So you will get this. You will get 50 times the kilograms of meat out of a prawn recirculating aquaculture tank than you would out of the same area under beef. And there's no reason why, that there are already factories that are a couple of kilometres long, because they just basically stack these things one after the other, producing these things. So I don't know what the future for food actually is. It's certainly one where that one thing I said about uncertainty and our attitudes to risk is very important. Now, do we want to be risk neutral? Do we want to be risk averse? Probably, yeah. But honestly, if I knew what the price of wheat was going to be, even at the end of this decade, I wouldn't be in this job.
Maybe this could be your last question since this is online, and then we go upstairs. So Linker says hi, Ian. And Ross Kingwell says,
Lovely.
how do you account for agriculture's historical and future ability to adapt through research and development and innovation to climate change versus the responsiveness of biodiversity to climate change?
So I think my previous question answered sort of half of that. I think it's very uncertain what's going to happen with technology, but I'd be really surprised if the current pressures don't result in really quite dramatic change in agricultural productivity, perhaps not of the type that we are used to now. It could all be, I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen, Blade Runner
2049.
Thank you, yeah, where they're all eating bugs, I'm not looking forward to that, but, it's an interesting one. We may have to adapt our diet quite dramatically into the future. Biodiversity, I'm much less hopeful about. I actually feel reasonably, climate change, we can stop climate change. I have absolutely no doubt about it. Whether we will is not a question of technology. We already have sufficient technology to do this. I showed you that graph. I think it is appalling that we are investing billions, 22 billion, I think it was, could have been 28, in CCS, when carbon capture and storage, when we could be investing that money in renewables. But that's our choice, that were the choice of the people we elect. So whether we will stop climate change or not is not, in my mind, a technical question. It's a question of will. Biodiversity, I feel tremendously despondent about, because people do not understand, in the way they do have some understanding of climate, that we depend on biodiversity. They don't. It's not so obvious to people. The links between, say, biodiversity and ecosystem processes like the hydrological cycle, the carbon cycle, the nutrient cycle are not well understood. Not even by scientists. Definitely, I don't understand them. I know that eventually, if you push biodiversity far enough, it collapses and those cycles are severely impaired, but we don't know where. And so I am concerned that we will just push and push and push, and then we'll know when the limit is, because we'll have passed it.
Yeah. And we have 1 minute left for one question. I'm going to ask you something upstairs on that. But Lincoln says, thanks for the presentation. You know the challenge of uncertainty, but policy decisions still need to be made now. So how do you facilitate this into a sensible support tool that's accessible to both? Economists are good at modeling uncertainty, but it's not easily translated, which you touch on it.
I mean, that's what I tried to convey with the uncertainty thing. You can say to someone, look, these are the range of futures that are out there. The real problem with the IPC stuff is it says, let's look at 4 futures. And each one of them are radically different. And that, in a way, doesn't help decision makers very much, because a decision under one is correct and under another it's incorrect. So what we're trying to do with bringing in the uncertainty stuff is to say, do be aware of the different payoffs, both value-wise and ecosystem service-wise, if climate doesn't turn out to be Paris and it turns out to be something else. Okay, the payoffs by the time you get to 8.5 are not worth thinking about. It's absolutely dreadful.
You're probably in worse trouble than anyway.
Sorry?
You're in worse trouble than anyways.
Yeah, I mean, it almost becomes academic. I don't know how life is going to survive with 8+ billion people on a planet under RCP 8. But the others, you can at least say, right, well, here are the consequences under all of those. How do you feel about this uncertainty? Are you happy to just take a £1 loss equal to a £1 gain? Or do you want to hedge against losses? In which case you will change the decision you make. I'm not a politician, I don't have the right to make that decision, but what we can do is show it to people.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much.
Okay.